This is the Extra Point Podcast. During this podcast, we will dive deeper into our Sunday teaching and share practical next steps for your faith journey. Now, let's kick off the Extra Point.
Well, welcome to the Extra Point. I'm Cheryl Ross, the Next Steps and Discipleship Pastor here at Southridge Church, and I'm with Scott Beha, our lead pastor. And we are in a new series called Fight Song, where we've you're picking some Psalms to preach through. And Sunday, you did Psalm 3.
Yep.
Just share with us a little bit about what you hope that we get out of this series.
Yeah, so this series, it's kind of similar to the last series, because really what I was trying to do with the last series, I Pity the Fool, was give you a small sample of how you can use the Proverbs to shine, light onto your own life if you'll just go out and you seek this out. The same thing really with the Psalms. Like I opened up Sunday talking about how the Psalms, they will really meet you right where you're at. And so what I wanted to do was to show how you could go and read one of these Psalms for all that it's worth and kind of resonate with the author, but then see how the path that the author kind of brings you out of. And so that's what I'm hoping, because I don't know if I said it first service, but I said it in second service. There's 150 Psalms, so I can't. That would take us, 3 years to go through all of them. So I'm not going to do that. I'm going to show you how to go through 4 of them, and then this should be equipping you now to go and read the other 146 on your own and get out of it what you need to get out of it. That's really where I think the last year or so I have felt kind of God leading our teaching is, hey, we just need to help our congregation know how to go out and get the most out of the Bible.
Right.
And in the way that we teach here, I hope that's that's what people are getting.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm hoping here, is that a whole nother book of the Bible will be unlocked to people, that they'll realize that they can access the Psalms and can get everything out of it that they need.
Yeah, absolutely. I know the Psalms have been really key and integral at those moments in my life as well, when I'm struggling, or even just giving me some hope or some peace in those moments and those times. But so you shared from Psalm 3, and the first couple verses, David is just sharing about how he feels like the odds are stacked against him, and his reputation's taken a hit. And you talked a little bit about how often, you feel like, why did the role that God called me to have to be so difficult? And I think in ministry and even our jobs, often we end up in places where we feel that, like, man, this is not easy. And a lot of people are fine with that. Like, they can enjoy just the status quo of just chugging along and being in that easy place. But often that's rare. I think more often than not, you have difficulty in jobs. And so just share with us a little bit more about, like, what that means within ministry, within jobs, within our home lives. Like, how can that come to play, and how can we just really look at those difficult moments and see something different?
Yeah, I think maybe the power of it is to get us to just have the proper expectations. I think so many times people think that because they're doing what God's called them to do or asked them to do, or I feel God led me to this, that they think that it's going to be easy. And then they get like disillusioned when the world and life just still is not easy. I remember, like, I think, being in ministry almost 12 years now, I've seen that when people come in, they think it's one thing, and then it's something else. But this is true of, like we're having a lot of babies born around the church. And I see all these new parents and stuff, and I go, listen, yes, God chose you to be their parent, but that doesn't mean it's going to be easy.
Right.
It's like parenting is one of the most difficult things that I've ever been called to do, and I suck at it. Like, I feel like my kids are all going to be 10 and 9 this year, and I'm like, I'm over halfway done with them, and I feel like I'm still haven't figured out how to do it the right way. But it's what I was called to, but that doesn't mean that it's going to be easy. And so I think having the proper perspective, like some people will give up on something because it's hard.
Yeah.
Because they'll go like, oh, well, the Lord's not blessing it or whatnot.
Yeah.
And it's like that like some of the, like, especially in ministry, like there's these churches that all of us, like, we look up to, we follow, like, man, look at, they got 1,000 people, 2,000 people, 5,000 people. And the vast majority of those stories started out very small and just getting it going.
Yeah.
It just didn't happen overnight.
Yeah.
And so like there's some pastors that they were faithful for decades and decades and decades before God promoted them to a level of, hey, now you're going to preach to 5,000 people a weekend. And early on, like if they had that mindset, like, well, man, this is so hard, like it doesn't seem like things are really going, then they might have quit. They might have changed course. They might have jumped off the train before they should have. And so that's why, like, this whole idea of, like, God, why does it have to be so difficult? Because David is in this situation, like, his son has turned his back on him and taken his kingdom from him. And, like, God called David to be the king. And, like, it's like every time David turns around, there is something else. Like, it starts all the way back at the beginning when David is anointed as the king of Israel, and yet for years is never actually the king. In fact, he's chased around by the king, who is an absolute madman, running for his life. And so the whole time David has to be thinking, like, God, why does this have to be so hard? Yeah. Why do we have to continue? Why do I have to keep fighting for what you said was already mine?
Right.
And so we have this wrong mindset that, like, just because God said it was yours or God called you to it, that it's just going to be smooth sailing, it's going to be so easy. It's not, because you see this all throughout the scriptures, and you see this all throughout life. It is the overlap of God's sovereignty and the overlap of human responsibility that is really where the intersection of the divine and the secular, of us and God, where that intersects is always God's sovereignty and our human responsibility. Just for the fact that God called you to it and ultimately will accomplish his purposes does not release you from working hard and being obedient in that season.
Yeah.
But also, just because you're a really hard worker and you're pretty clever, you can figure it out on your own, doesn't mean that you don't need God's sovereignty either. Right. It's in that overlap space right there where things really begin to happen. And so that's what David, if he's frustrated because this calling to be king is so difficult. I mean, if he thought it was going to be easy, he might throw in the towel. Yeah. But he knows it's not going to be easy. Yeah. Whatsoever, and that's why he can be in it for the long haul.
Yeah, I think that's so good. I think that's why, I've witnessed with you, and I've kind of taken that in with other people of whenever we hear somebody say that they feel called to ministry or that kind of thing, like, you share with them, hey, like, it's going to be hard. It's difficult. Like, we like to share those truths with them, not to scare them off of it, but to just set them up with that right expectation to know, like, hey, you're going to need to have some other pastor friends because ministry can be lonely. It can be hard. Like, in this moment, like we see David, he's got to feel extremely lonely. Like, even with, you shared how he does have some followers and things, but still, like, you see the negative a lot of times more often than you see the positive. And so just remembering that even though it can be very difficult, it can also be really rewarding. And it's those rewarding times that kind of help keep us pressing forward in the difficult times. But it's also like the difficult times that make those rewarding moments so much more special. Yeah. So in verse 3, we see this mindset shift take place where David says, even with all that, like he says, but you, O Lord, are a shield around me. You are my glory, the one who holds me high. And you talked a lot about changing your mindset and that shift that needs to take place, and that's going to make the difference between understanding, like, even in the difficulty, like, if you can have that mindset shift of saying, like, even now, even when it's tough, even when it seems like the odds are stacked against me, even when, I can't seem to break through to my kids at all, like, even in those moments, like, knowing that God is still there is extremely important. So let's talk a little bit about mindset.
I think a lot of us have the mindset that God is unable to fix some of these types of things.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, if you've got someone gossiping about you, you've got someone, defaming your character, whatever. Like these things, and maybe you're not even aware of it, but you're not expecting God to step into those situations. And what I see is that God is a protection all the way around us. That's even the stuff going on behind us, behind the scenes, the things that we can't see, the blind sides coming. Like, God can actually work in all of those situations if you will allow Him to.
Yeah.
And if you will trust Him to do that, because, I mean, that's what's so neat about verse 3 when He says, "You're a shield around me." It's like, if we're familiar with shields, for the most part, they cover one side, really.
Yeah.
But this one is a shield around me. Like, He's got you on 360 degrees. He's taking care of it. He's got all of those angles, even the ones that you can't see, the ones that you can see. And I think sometimes we're only thinking God can really do stuff in, like, these really big things, but also in these little things. Like, can He influence people's opinions of you? Can He, like, and before, like, sometimes I'll get into this mindset too, like, well, that person's not a Christian, so they're not going to listen to God. But then I'm all the time reminded that there was plenty of times that God used the ungodly to do certain, like, to get His will done. So that I wouldn't count God out from being able to influence anyone. To be honest, like, when Israel was exiled, the one that brought them out of exile was not from the people of God.
Right.
Cyrus was he was a Gentile, and yet he's the one that delivers God's people. Like, and so how could God get him to do that? Well, that's because God has a lot more influence with people than what we tend to think. So most of the time we'll try to rely on ourselves rather than Him, because we're like, oh, God can't do nothing about my reputation. It is what it is. And it's like, that's not really true. But then at the same time, I always want to hold intention. Even if He doesn't do anything about it and your reputation is completely destroyed, is God still enough in that moment?
Yeah.
If you lose everything, if everyone starts thinking poorly of you, because it's not, none of this is, oh, God's going to protect me, so nothing bad's ever going to happen. That's just not, that's not reality.
Right.
I would say verse 3, when he talks about God being a shield, is like, this is what God is and what He can be, but then He also allows sometimes for things to happen, and that can even be seen as a sort of protection.
Yeah.
Like, the things that I've gone through in my past are still protecting me now, because God used them to make me a different person now than I was then, and that's a weird way of protection, but it's still protection in that sense.
Yeah.
And so, He says that He's His shield. It says that He's His glory. So He's the one that He's not taking a humble position in the midst of His pain. Whereas most people, we like to be the center of attention in the midst of our pain. Like, if any of us were David, we would have gone from town to town just telling our sob story to everyone. Yeah. Can you believe what Absalom did to me? Did you see how he took my crown? Did you see how he slept with my wives on the roof so everyone could see him? Did you see what he did? Like, we would have just gone from town to town to the way we could tell our story to everyone, so the way we're always, like, in the center of attention. Yeah. Because that's what people do. Like, they just, as soon as you have a sad story to tell, you run up to everyone you can find so you can just lay it on them, and it's like, goodness gracious. Yeah. David's not going to do that. David's like, no, it's all about God's glory. So in the midst of all of this, he's going to give God the glory. He's going to put that, and then he reminds himself that the fact that He is the lifter of my head. He's the one that He wakes me up every morning. He's the one that sustains me. And at the end of the day, if God doesn't come through in the way that you want Him to, He'll still do that. Yeah. He'll still wake you up and give you purpose and passion, no matter what's happened before that. Like, those are the things that God does, and that's what He can do. But that's where verse 4 comes in. David cries out to God. Like, if you don't cry out to God, then don't expect that to happen. Right. Don't expect David to, or don't expect God to come intervene if you're still trying to handle it all on your own. Yeah. Now, and again, there always has to be a tension in all this, because if you want to just sit back and don't worry, God's going to take care of it, no. Right. Again, God's sovereignty meshes with human responsibility. Maybe you do need to go have a conversation, but you don't need to go up and have you don't have to go get up in somebody's face.
Right.
You might need to have a conversation. You may need to go and do something or whatever it may be, but you don't have to go the route that the world always tells us to go. But then also there's others sometimes that we just need to shut up and sit back and let God take care of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the only way that you'll ever figure out which one of those paths you're supposed to take is if you stay really connected in prayer in those really low seasons of life. Because then you can know, all right, well, this is, I feel God leading me to go have this conversation. I feel God leading me to go do this, to whatever. You'll hear that in prayer. And then other times you might just hear, hey, sit down, shut up, I've got this. Okay, but you got to be willing to know that. That's where verse 4 comes in. He cried out and he said, and he heard me. And I think I'm finally getting to the point in my life that I find comfort in the fact that God knows even if he won't fix it.
Yeah.
Because I know that if God's a good father, that he'll fix it if it needs fixed, or if it doesn't need fixed because it's for my good.
Yeah.
Then I'm to that point. It doesn't mean that I like that whatsoever.
Right.
But I do understand that as long as he knows, I'm comfortable with it. So if I got something on my heart, I lift it up in prayer. I can then I can go look, I've done what I've done what I could do.
Yeah.
I always like that Facebook post that people always share. If God gave you everything that you prayed for yesterday, what would be different about the world today?
Yeah.
And you go well, it wouldn't rain. Because we just ask in prayer for really silly stuff. But what if you really did just whatever it is that's troubling your heart, you just prayed about it, and then that's a way of kind of being able to get rid of it. It's kind of the same thing for me, the way that my mind operates. Sometimes I'll get so many ideas all at once that if I don't write them down, I'll lose them all. And it'll drive me insane. Then I'll spend all day trying to figure out what it was that I didn't write down that I needed to write down. So sometimes in the mornings when I'm in the office, I've got so much stuff just bombarding my mind, I'll just have to pull out something, start writing stuff down. Because it gets it out of me and onto here, and now that's where I can manage it. It's the same thing with prayer. These things that are just bombarding you, I'm worried about this, I'm worried about this, I'm worried about this, I'm worried about this. If you'll just start handing those over to God in prayer, then it's going to kind of offload you a little bit, but sometimes we just hold on to all of that.
Yeah.
David found incredible comfort in verse 5 and 6 because he was willing to do that.
Yeah. I think that's so important. I think that kind of shows the difference. When you talked about it on Sunday and when I read through your notes, early on in the week, it reminded me of someone who shared at Global Leadership Summit last year. And she talked about that difference between a fixed mindset and a growth mindset. And really that difference is recognizing all those things and seeing it as an opportunity to improve or get better. The people who have that fixed mindset, they're just going to stay in it. They're not going to allow it to improve them or to make something better. They're going to sit there and continue to be the victim or talk about it. And I think it's incredibly important in so many different areas of our life to remember that mindset really does matter. And just when you said getting it, calling out to God, sharing it with God, knowing that maybe he won't fix everything is tough. But I think about with my kids, there are moments I remember when Carter was a little baby or, a toddler and he's climbing on everything and falling and, we tell him not to do things. But sometimes they have to learn on their own, what not to do. And part of the growth mindset is learning from those mistakes. And I think it's the same thing, with other areas of our life, when we can look at those difficult seasons or those tough things that we have to go through, there's usually something we can learn from. And although, I'm sure it's not easy to sit back, as a father, as a parent, it's not easy to sit there and watch your kid possibly get hurt. But knowing that once they do, they'll realize, hey, I shouldn't do that again. Yeah. And so, that's what came to mind with that. But knowing that there is comfort in being able to offload. I tell people a lot of times when they're I just feel like this is silly. I shouldn't pray about this or I shouldn't do it. And I'm listen, God can handle whatever. Let him have it.
It's gonna drive you
he's
crazy
a really big
not.
God. Take it to him. Let him have it. He can handle that and understand that he'll hear you. And he sees all that anyway, but it's difficult. But I think that that idea, like you said, you know, a lot of times we have trouble trusting an invisible God to come through with our very real problems. I think the struggle with that often comes like from the fact that we forget what you said next is that God has a track record that you
Yeah.
can trust. Like in those difficult moments, it can be easy to focus on those problems, like you said in the beginning. Like you can focus on that negativity and that stuff, and you forget to remember like all those things that He's brought you through in the past.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's a reason why, like, there's so much real estate in the scriptures devoted to remembering, because the human condition is to forget anything good and to only ever dwell on the negative.
Yeah.
Like there's a whole book, the whole book of Deuteronomy essentially is a look back at all of God's faithfulness.
Yeah.
And like you could write your own book of Deuteronomy if you were being, honest. Like watch how God has oversaw your whole life and brought you through so much. I know that if I were to ask you 5 bad things that have happened to you in your life, you could probably go boom, 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 boom. So give me 5 things God's done in your life, and I swear people will go like, because either like if something good did happen, like you may not even attribute to God. You may just be like, oh well, that's just life, or that's just how awesome I am, or that's whatever, I was lucky, or whatever whatever you want to say. But like if I asked you to name 5 painful things, like I bet you could do that in an instant. Whereas if I said, show me 5 times God came through for you. So like why not just write your own book of Deuteronomy and go like, listen, this is how God has come through over and over and over and over, and like I can look back even before I even got saved, and I have answers to that question of how God. I was in 2 different car wrecks when I was in high school and college. That the paramedics both times told my parents I should be dead.
Yeah.
And here I am. I don't know why I'm still here. I was an idiot. There's been like over and over and over things like that I could look back. I mentioned it again Sunday. Like Landon was born with some sort of lung issue. He had a pneumothorax the night that he was born, and he almost died. God, through the common grace of medicine and just His mercy in my life, that's taken care of.
Yeah.
Right? Like just over and over and over, watch God come through in my life, watch Him come through in my family's life, growing up with my grandmother. I watch it as a pastor now. I get to watch God come through in all these other people's lives. So, like, I have quite a, like, yesterday, nobody even probably knows this. There was a young man here yesterday that went through one of the most traumatic medical things that you could imagine. And, like, it was like, who knows if he's even going to make it. And he was here with his dad yesterday, walking in, talking. And I'm like, how? I mean, you want to look at that and go like, I don't know if I can trust an invisible God with my very real problems, man. That right there was just, and that, as I looked out throughout the crowd, I was like, man, I know all kinds of stories like this, of where like God has just come through over and over and over and over. But so that's why there's so much talk of remembrance, like, hey, remember what the Lord has done. Remember what the Lord has done. Remember what the Lord has done. Because we are prone to forget it or to misappropriate the credit. Like, oh, no, that was me. That was, somebody else came through for me or whatever it was. And it's like this God from the beginning has a track record of winning, of coming through for His people.
Yeah, I love that. I think there's just so much power in writing things down because, one, it also triggers like a different section of your brain to help you remember it more, like just the act of writing it down. But then you have something to look back on. I used to be much better about prayer journals when I was a teenager. I was really into it. And like I could, in my early 20s, I was able to look back at some of those prayers I'd prayed and like see where even in those times where God didn't answer that prayer, like He came through in a way that I definitely needed Him to. But also those moments and those times where like, oh man, I forgot that I prayed about that and He actually had come through in this way. And like seeing those things, like there's just that ability to like whether it's offloading what's on your heart, and then also being able to write those moments down. Like last year during sabbatical, I had to go out and buy a notebook to be able to write some things down that God was speaking to me about, because it happened on like night one, like morning one of my sabbatical. Like God shared something with me, and I wasn't prepared for it. And I was like, I need to go get a notebook so I can write this down, so I can look back at this moment in those times when I'm struggling in the future. I can look back at this and see God knew what I needed, and he spoke to me in this moment. Like I had a friend who had done this like during a really stressful financial time in her life. She had a notebook where she began writing all the ways that God like had blessed them over and above, like in ways that they never expected or didn't ask for. And that was something she went back to regularly during that season to like look and say, okay, well, you came through here, you did this here, you did this. So I know that you're going to be here with us in this moment. I think there's just so much power in that, like just prayer in general. I think you've talked about this. We've hit on this multiple times over the last few weeks. Like prayer is something that is always going to be a step, like a practical next step for you in your faith, regardless of what's going on. Remembering to pray and allow God to fight in those moments for you. Remember, I think you ended with saying, you said if you fought more battles in prayer, you'd have to fight less in other ways. Yeah. It's just so practical, so simple, and yet like often we don't do that.
No.
It
should be our first resort. It's normally our last.
Yeah.
I'm telling you, this is the reason why I want to teach the Bible the way that to help people understand how to use the Bible as a resource for their life, and prayer, because at the end of the day, those two things make the biggest difference in the life of people that say that they're serious about following God.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So if you are new to listening to us, make sure that you like and subscribe this podcast, so that way you don't miss out on any new content. And if you miss Sunday's teaching, then make sure you go back and listen to it. You can catch us here on YouTube or iTunes, Apple Podcasts, all those things, all the places. So make sure that you like and subscribe, and we'll be back here again next week with some more practical next steps for your faith journey.
Thanks for tuning in to The Extra Point. Be sure to subscribe to the Southridge Church podcast and tune in every Wednesday for another episode of The Extra Point.